The first time I saw the locket, nestled among my mother-in-law Mill's forgotten things in the attic, a cold dread slithered down my spine, because the girl in the faded photograph looked exactly like me. But the inscription on the back was dated 20 years before we ever met. It was a doppelganger captured in silver and sepia, a ghost from a past that wasn't mine, yet felt inextricably tied to my present. My husband Mark and I, 32F, had been married for 3 blissful years. Years that felt like a safe, sun-drenched harbor after the tumultuous seas of my own family history. We lived in a charming, light-filled city apartment, a stark contrast to the sprawling, slightly decaying Victorian house his parents, Phil and Mill, had occupied for decades. That house always felt like a living entity to me, its dark wood paneling and heavy draperies seeming to swallow sound and light, holding secrets in its shadowy corners. Phil, 62M, was a quiet, kind man, a retired history teacher with a passion for model trains and a seemingly infinite patience for his wife's often difficult temperament. He was a placid lake, while Mill, 60F, was the unpredictable storm cloud overhead. She had always been overly attached to Mark, her only child, and from the beginning, I felt a subtle, simmering resentment from her that went beyond the typical mother-in-law cliché. It was in the way her smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me, the backhanded compliments about my ambition for pursuing a freelance graphic design career, which she dismissively called my little hobby. She'd make comments about how I'd stolen her little boy, or how my city life was superficial. I'd always brushed it off, armoring myself with politeness and firm boundaries, believing it was a battle of attrition I could win with grace. The discovery happened during a weekend visit we'd been somewhat dreading. Phil had asked Mark for help clearing out a section of the cavernous attic, a task long overdue and one Mill had always vehemently opposed. "It's my past, my memories, you have no right to touch them," she'd once snapped when Phil had broached the subject. But a leak in the roof had forced the issue. Dust motes danced like frantic spirits in the slants of light piercing the small, grimy windows. The air was thick with the smell of old wood, mothballs, and forgotten memories. While the men wrestled with a heavy, antique trunk filled with Phil's old textbooks, I was tasked with sorting through a smaller, more personal-looking cardboard box tucked away behind a stack of old National Geographic magazines. It was Mill's, labeled in her sharp, angular handwriting. "College and beyond private. Do not discard." Feeling like an intruder, but compelled by a curiosity I couldn't name, I lifted the lid. It held the ephemera of a young woman's life. Ticket stubs from long-closed cinemas, a dried corsage, a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. And there, tucked beneath a bundle of yellowed poetry books by Sylvia Plath and Emily Dickinson, was the locket. It was a simple, oval-shaped piece of tarnished silver, cool and heavy in my palm. My heart beat a little faster as I fumbled with the delicate, stubborn clasp. It opened with a quiet, definitive click. Inside was a small, black-and-white photograph of a young woman with long, dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her head thrown back in laughter, her eyes sparkling with a joy that seemed to leap across the decades. Her eyes, her smile, the slight, confident tilt of her head. It was like looking at a ghost of myself, a version from a parallel universe. A cold knot tightened in my stomach, and my hands trembled as I turned the locket over. An inscription was crudely engraved on the back, as if done by an amateur hand. "To Amelia, forever yours. J. 1998 foot." I did the math quickly, my blood running cold. I would have been 12 years old, all scraped knees and braces, living in a different state. Mark was 14, likely more interested in video games than girls. We hadn't met until a mutual friend's party in 2018. This was a photograph of a complete stranger from 2 decades ago. A stranger who could have been my twin. "Find something interesting, Sarah?" Mill's voice, sharp and sudden as a shard of glass, came from the top of the attic stairs. I jumped, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I snapped the locket shut and clenched it in my palm, the metal biting into my skin. Just some old poetry books. Sylvia Plath, I stammered, quickly shoving the locket deep into the front pocket of my jeans. I couldn't explain the primal, urgent need to hide it from her. The instinctual fear that coiled in my gut. She stood there, silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway, her eyes, narrow and suspicious, scanning my face, then dropping to my clenched fist. "That box is private," she said, her voice dangerously low. "I'd appreciate it if you left my things alone. Some memories are not for public consumption." I muttered a hasty apology and quickly moved away to help Mark and Phil with the trunk, the weight of the locket feeling like a stolen secret, burning a hole in my pocket. For the rest of the weekend, I was a ghost at the feast, my smile brittle, my laughter forced. Every time I caught Mill looking at me, a strange, unreadable expression flickered in her eyes. Was it a fresh wave of hatred? A flicker of painful longing? Or sheer, unadulterated fear? I couldn't decipher it, and that ambiguity was terrifying. Back home in our safe, modern apartment, the world felt different. The familiar skyline outside our window seemed menacing, the shadows in our hallway deeper. I became obsessed. That night, I showed the locket to Mark after dinner, my hands still shaking. He took it, peering at the photograph under the bright kitchen light. "Wow," he breathed, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "She really does look like you. It's uncanny. But who is she? Amelia? I've never heard Mom mention anyone by that name." He shrugged, trying to land on a rational explanation. "You know how Mom is. She had a whole life before Dad. Probably some old college roommate or a cousin she had a falling out with. A weird coincidence, that's all." But I couldn't let it go. A coincidence this precise felt like a crack in the foundation of reality. The following week, while Mark was at work, I fell down a rabbit hole. I became a digital archaeologist, excavating the ruins of Mill's past. I scoured online databases of old yearbooks from the small liberal arts college Phil had once mentioned she attended. I searched digital archives of local newspapers from the town where the college was located. I tried to find any public record. A birth, a marriage, a death, of an Amelia connected to Mill's maiden name, Millicent Graves. It was futile. It was as if the woman in the locket had never existed, her existence wiped clean. My first real break came from an unexpected source. Remembering the initial J from the inscription, I casually asked Phil, during one of our weekly, usually cheerful phone calls, if Mill had ever been particularly close with anyone whose name started with J. Maybe a friend from her art class? There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear his guard going up. "Why do you ask, Sarah?" His voice was carefully neutral, stripped of its usual warmth. My mouth went dry. I fabricated a flimsy story about a friend who was researching local artisans and had come across a potter with that initial who might have known Mill. It was a terrible lie, but it was all I had. He was quiet for another moment, the silence stretching taut between us. "There was a man," he finally said, the words seeming to cost him effort. James Albright. He was a significant part of her life before we were serious. It didn't end well." He changed the subject abruptly, asking about Mark's work, his discomfort a palpable force even over the phone. James Albright. The name was new, a key sliding into a lock I hadn't known existed. A new, more frantic search began. It took days of combing through obscure forums and paid public record sites, but I finally found it. A brief, 3-paragraph article from a small-town weekly paper dated November 1999. James Albright, 24, a promising young photographer, had died in a tragic accidental fire that had rapidly consumed his combined studio and apartment above a laundromat. The article was short, a tragic footnote in a small town's history. My blood ran cold as I read it. Had Mill known? Was this the J? The date was just a year after the inscription in the locket. A promising artist and his muse, one dead, one vanished. Driven by a growing cold terror, I knew I needed professional help. I hired a private investigator, a retired police detective named Frank Evans who came highly recommended and had a no-nonsense demeanor that I found reassuring. I met him in his modest, organized office and gave him the locket, the name James Albright, Mill's full name, and the little I knew. Find the connection, I told him, my voice trembling only slightly. Find out who Amelia really was and what happened to her. 2 agonizing weeks later, Evans called me back into his office. His face was grim, his earlier professional detachment replaced by a somber gravity. He slid a thin manila folder across his desk. "It's not a pretty story, Ms. Evans," he said, his tone implying that was a profound understatement. "You should prepare yourself." The file contained copies of old documents and a handful of recovered and scanned photographs. One was a professional headshot of James Albright. He was handsome, with intense, dark eyes and a sensitive, artistic face, a lock of hair falling over his forehead. Another was a candid shot of him with the woman from the locket, Amelia. They were sitting on a park bench, his arm around her, both of them young, vibrant, and radiating a happiness that made my heart ache. They were clearly deeply in love. The final document in the stack made my breath catch in my throat. It was a copy of an old police report. The fire at James Albright's studio had, at one point, been investigated as possible arson. An unnamed witness had reported seeing a woman, described as slender, with long dark hair, very agitated, arguing with James on the street hours before the blaze. The report noted the woman matched the general description of Millicent Graves, James's former girlfriend, with whom he had recently ended a volatile relationship. Due to a lack of physical evidence and the witnesses' subsequent retraction of their statement, the case was closed and ruled an accident. "What happened to Amelia?" I whispered, my throat so dry the words were barely audible. Evans sighed, steepling his fingers. "Amelia Shaw disappeared without a trace about a month after James died. She was reported missing by her family, but she was an adult, and there was no immediate evidence of foul play. The detective on the case noted in his log that the family believed she was running from a threat related to Mr. Albright's death. But without a body, a crime scene, or a cooperative witness, the case went ice cold. She was never seen or heard from again." The pieces were clicking into a horrifying, undeniable mosaic. Mill had been obsessively in love with James. He had rejected her for Amelia, a woman who looked like me. The accidental fire, Amelia's terrified disappearance. It couldn't all be a tragic sequence of coincidences. And I, with my uncanny resemblance to the woman Mill saw as her rival, had walked right into the heart of this decades-old tragedy. Mill's resentment wasn't just about her son. I was a living, breathing ghost from a past she had tried to violently bury, a daily, walking reminder of a man she might have murdered and a woman she might have driven to her death. I confided everything in Mark that evening, laying out the locket, the photographs, and the investigator's report on our living room coffee table like evidence in a trial. He was initially skeptical, then visibly shaken, his face pale. He struggled, unable to reconcile the image of his mother as a potential murderer with the woman who had read him bedtime stories and held his hand when he got his first stitches. But the evidence was a relentless tide, eroding his denial. The timeline, the witness description, my resemblance, the sheer, twisted logic of it all. We decided we had to confront Phil together, hoping against hope that he knew more. that he could provide some context that would somehow make this nightmare less monstrous. We invited him to our apartment on a pretext, ensuring Mill wouldn't suspect. When we laid out the locket and the investigators' findings, Phil seemed to age 10 years in front of our eyes. The color drained from his face, and he slumped in the armchair as if the bones had been removed from his body. He put his head in his hands for a long moment before looking up, his eyes filled with a profound, weary sorrow that told me everything before he even spoke. I have spent a good portion of my married life fearing something like this, he confessed, his voice a broken whisper. When I met Mill, she was fragile, deeply heartbroken over this James fellow. She called him the love of her life. She never got over him, not really. She'd have terrible nightmares, talk in her sleep about fire and that girl stealing what was rightfully hers. I found that locket once, years ago, tucked in her jewelry box. When I asked her about it, she flew into a rage I'd never seen before or since. She screamed that it was a friend who had moved away, and that it was none of my business. I wanted to believe her. I loved her. I thought having Mark would help her heal, would give her a new focus for all that intensity. He looked at me, and his gaze was filled with such apology and grief it was almost unbearable. When you came along, Sarah, and I saw how much you looked like that photograph, I felt physically sick. I saw the way Mill looked at you. It wasn't just dislike or jealousy. It was recognition. And a hatred so deep it scared me. I thought if I just ignored it, pretended it wasn't happening, it would go away. I am so sorry. It was the confirmation we needed, the final piece that locked the horror into place. Mark was devastated, the foundation of his childhood crumbling to dust around him. We knew we couldn't go to the police with decades-old cold cases and purely circumstantial evidence. No prosecutor would touch it. But we could no longer live with the silent, poisonous secret. We had to force the truth into the open, to stand in front of Mill, and let her see that we knew. The following Sunday, we drove to their house, a somber, silent car ride. We found Mill in the back garden, aggressively pruning rose bushes, the snip 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 of her shears sounding like a threat. When she saw the three of us approaching with identical, solemn expressions, her pleasant, hostess mask slipped, revealing the cold steel beneath. "What's this? A delegation?" she asked, her voice tight and mocking, her eyes darting from Phil's ashen face to Mark's pained one, finally landing on me with undisguised contempt. I placed the locket on the wrought iron garden table between us. It landed with a soft metallic thud. We know about Amelia Shaw Mill. And we know about James Albright. The change in her was instantaneous and terrifying. It was like watching a porcelain doll shatter to reveal a monstrous, writhing core. Her face contorted, all pretense of civility gone, replaced by a raw, feral rage. "You vile, snooping little bitch," she spat, her voice a guttural snarl, her eyes blazing with a venom that made me take an involuntary step back. "You had no right. You think you're so clever, don't you? Digging up ancient history that is none of your damn business. Did you do it, Mom?" Mark's voice was raw with a pain I had never heard before. "Did you set that fire? What did you do to Amelia?" She laughed then, a harsh, brittle sound that held no humor, only madness. "James was a fool. A blind, stupid fool. He threw me away for that. That little nobody. He said my love was suffocating. That I was too much. He deserved what he got. He deserved to burn." She was screaming now, spittle flying from her lips. And her gaze, full of pure, undiluted hatred, locked onto me, and it was like staring into the heart of a black hole. She was supposed to leave. She was supposed to be gone forever. But she left her ghost behind, didn't she? She left you. She took a step toward me, her finger jabbing in my direction like a weapon. You're her ghost coming back to haunt me. Living in my house, smiling with my son's face, stealing my family, just like she tried to do. You are her. It wasn't a courtroom confession to murder, but it was a confession of the soul. She was admitting to her motive, her all-consuming obsession, her bottomless hatred. She saw me not as Sarah, her son's wife, but as a spectral manifestation of her rival. A ghost she needed to exorcise a second time. Phil spoke then, his voice quiet but with a firm, unshakable resolve I had never heard from him. It's over, Mill. I've spent 40 years living with a ghost and a lie. I've made excuses for you. I've looked the other way. I've buried my own fears for the sake of peace. I can't do it anymore. I won't. She turned her fury on him. A torrent of screamed accusations, blaming him for being weak, for being a failure, for siding with that girl over his own wife. It was a chaotic, ugly scene that ended with Mark putting his arm around me and leading me away from the screaming, back to the car. Phil followed us out a few minutes later, carrying a small, hastily packed duffel bag. He couldn't stay in that house with that woman for another night. In the weeks that followed, Phil moved into a small, sparse rented apartment and began the painful process of filing for divorce. Mill's descent was rapid, dramatic, and public. She sent long, rambling, hate-filled emails and handwritten letters, their tone shifting wildly. One would accuse me of witchcraft and of orchestrating the destruction of her family with my demonic resemblance. The next would be a tear-stained plea for Mark to see how I was manipulating him. She showed up at Mark's workplace, sobbing and causing such a scene at the reception desk that his boss had to threaten to call security, an incident that mortified Mark and nearly cost him his job. We had no choice. We engaged a lawyer and secured a restraining order against her, the official paperwork feeling like a declaration of war on a ghost that had become all too real. The final, heartbreaking chapter came from an unexpected source. A few months after the confrontation, we were contacted by an elderly woman named Eleanor, who lived across the country. Our private investigator, following one last dogged hunch, had managed to track down Amelia Shaw's younger sister. We spoke to her on a video call, Phil sitting with us for support, a box of tissues on the table between us. With tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks, Eleanor confirmed our darkest suspicions in a soft, trembling voice. My sister Amelia was the light of our family. She was so vibrant, so in love with life, and so deeply in love with James, she said. He was her world. They were going to leave that town, move to New York, start a new life together. After he died, the light in her went out. She was a shell. Then, about a month later, she got a phone call. I'll never forget the look on her face. She told me it was from a woman, someone who had also been in love with James. She said the woman threatened her, told her that James's fire was a warning, and that if she didn't disappear, if she ever spoke his name again, she'd end up just like him. Amelia was terrified. Truly, deeply terrified. She came to me that night, gave me a small box of her most precious things, including some of James's photographs, and she left. She told me it was safer for everyone, for me, for our parents, if she just vanished. She made me promise not to look for her. I never heard from my big sister again. She paused, wiping her eyes with a shaky hand. We always believed in our hearts that that woman had killed James and terrorized Amelia into running. We just never had any proof. We told the police, but they couldn't do anything. The woman's name. Amelia whispered it before she left. She said, "Be careful of Millicent." Millicent. Mill. It was the final, heartbreaking piece of the puzzle. We shared our collected evidence and Eleanor's solemn testimony with the police. As we expected, the cases were too old, the evidence too circumstantial and hearsay to formally reopen for prosecution. Mill was never charged with a crime, but in a way, she was finally and utterly defeated. The exposure of her secrets, the loss of her family, and the legal restraints of the restraining order broke something in her already fractured mind. According to the sparse, reluctant updates we received from a distant cousin who remained in touch, she was eventually forced to sell the oppressive Victorian house. The proceeds were quickly drained by her living expenses and what was described as erratic behavior. She now resides in a state-run assisted living facility. Her mind and spirit finally crumbled to dust under the unbearable weight of her own poisoned history. Phil, though marked by a deep and permanent sadness, found a quiet, steadfast peace in his new, honest life. His relationship with Mark, forged in the fires of shared trauma, became deeper and more authentic than ever before. For Mark and me, the horror of the past became a shadow we learned to live with, a dark, permanent chapter that, paradoxically, bound us together with unbreakable steel. The ghost of Amelia Shaw had finally been laid to rest, her story told, her memory honored. We were finally free to live our lives in the present, no longer haunted by the sins of the mother.